Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session today on best practices to secure your Google Compute Engine resources. My name is Lauren, and I'm the content manager for the Google Cloud community. And joining us today are Google Cloud technical account managers, Munish and Lax, who will be taking you through the content and answering your questions today. Questions are encouraged, so please feel free to add those into the YouTube chat box, and we'll be sure to get to them either in the chat or at the end of the presentation. And we do have a few pre-submitted questions that we will cover as well. And for any questions that we don't get to, please share them in the Google Cloud community, and the link to that is in the YouTube description. And someone from the community or the Google Cloud team will be happy to help you out. All right, with that, I will hand it over to the team to take us through the content today.
Thank you, Lauren. Hey, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. I hope that you have a pleasant day so far. And today we are going to look at some of the best practices for securing your workloads running on Google Compute Engine. Lauren, could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so these are the topics that we are going to cover today. This is what we are going to look at when it comes to Compute Engine. We are going to see how do we protect, or what do we actually mean by project-wide SSH keys? Why should we not use the default service account on the Compute Engine? Default VPC? What are some of the gotchas in the firewalls? Why should we not have an external IP, or when should we have an external IP? And we'll wrap it up with shielded VMs. Having said that, the first three items on this is a live demo. So I'll switch to my screen and show you rather than going through some slides to put the point across. So having said that, Lauren, I am going to look. Yeah, thank you. So what you are seeing right now are some of the VMs that I have pre-created in my project. And hopefully you can see it. It's big enough. Hopefully, let me know if it's not. So these are some of the VMs that are running in my own POC project. As you can see, some of them have an external IP, some of them don't. Some of them are running in a default VPC, some of them are running in a custom VPC. So these are the different shapes and sizes that I have for the VMs running in my project. We are going to tinker with one specific VM. We are calling it as VM US West 1. Notice it has an external IP. Every machine has an internal IP, but this specific one has an external IP, is running in a default VM, a default VPC. Now, on the left-hand menu, we have something known as, under settings, we have a thing called metadata. I'm going to click here on the metadata, and then you see metadata and SSH keys tab. I'm going to click on SSH keys tab. So our other co-presenter, Lakshman, I pre-created or pre-added his ID RSA public key into the account that you can see. This key belongs to our other co-presenter. That's his machine, his public key that I've added to my project. However, Lakshman is not part of the IAM permissions. So if I take you to the IAM permission, he does not exist here. He has no roles, no permissions on my POC project. All he has is his SSH key. His public SSH key is added into my POC. Now the fun starts. So I go back to my VM instances. I go back to this VM, which has a public IP, and it runs in a default VPC. So Lax, if you could share your screen and show us if you are able to SSH into this VM.
Sure. Thank you so much, Manish. So let me, I think, yeah, there you go, Manish.
You can clear your screen and show us if you are able to SSH.
So, team, this is the IP address that I'm going to connect, which is being demoed by Munish. So let me try SSH now.
Whoa. So you do not have any IAM permissions. Your user ID does not exist. You have no roles, no permissions, yet you are able to SSH to one of my VMs. This is what we mean by blocking the project-wide SSH keys. This is very dangerous. If you have the SSH keys enabled, the person does not need to be added to your IAMs. Even if Lakshman leaves the company, leaves Google, for example, but carries the same machine with him, and the SSH keys continue to remain in my project, Lakshman can continue to SSH into my VMs no matter where in the world he is. How do we block those keys? The best practices would be don't have anything in the SSH keys. Don't have anything in the SSH keys. The other way to work around this, go back to the VM. And then if you look at the properties of the VM, one of the properties will tell you whether you are blocking the keys or not. Under SSH keys, if you look at block project-wide SSH keys, it is currently turned off, which means that if you do have the SSH keys, like I do, then that person who has the private key to that public key can SSH into the VM without getting detected or without that person getting controlled through IAM permissions. All right, moving on to the second point, we said that do not run with the default service account. Right now, this specific VM, as you can see, is running with the default compute engine service account. Anytime you hear the word default within the GCP ecosystem, that's for convenience and not for security. Let me repeat that. Anytime you hear the word default, whether it's a default service account, default VPC network, or anything default, it's for convenience, for your playground, for your sandboxes. It's not for production. So you should be mindful of that. Now, this specific VM is running with the default service account. And why do we say that do not have this default service account? Let's go back to the IAM. I'm going to copy this name, go back to my IAM, and look for that account here. So if you notice, this is the default service account that my VM is running with. What is the problem? The problem is the role that is assigned to this service account by default. By default, your default service account has an editor role. And if you see the set of permissions that this guy has, it has 7,000 permissions. It has over 7,000 permissions. And the AI is in play here. AI is clearly telling me that out of the 7,057 permissions, 7,037 permissions have never been used by this account. So this account is way over provisioned than it should be. And because this is the default service account, you're better off creating your own custom account, custom service account, and run the compute engine machine with that custom service account. And that custom service account should only have the privileges that you really need. How do you know that these are the permissions that you really need? If you click on it, it'll tell you what are the permissions that you have actually ever used on these machines. You can carve out a custom IAM role with only those permissions and be done with it. So just to put the point across, never run your production workloads or sensitive workloads with default service accounts. Do not have your SSH keys enabled. And the Lauren, could you remind me what was the third point on the slides? Oh, default VPC network. Yeah, we touched upon the default VPC network a little bit. Now, if you notice again, this VM is running with the default network, default VPC network. What is the problem with the default VPC network? Let's get there. I am navigating to the VPC networks. I do have a whole bunch of networks. One of them is a default. which we strongly recommend to delete in your production or your sensitive projects. So in the default VPC network, one of the problem is port 22 is open for the entire world by default. Again, default just means convenience, does not mean the security. What we recommend is that you delete the default VPC network, you create your own VPC network and add the subnets only in the regions that you really need. So for example, if I go to my default VPC and take you to the firewall, you can see that in my firewall, I have a total of 47 rules, but those are spread across multiple VPCs. So let me filter down to the default VPC. So within the default VPC, I have 36 firewall rules out of the 47. Now, these 36 firewall rules, I did not create by hand. Some of them are pre-created in the default VPC, and that is the whole problem, that some of the rules that are pre-created by the default VPC are open to the entire world. And for that reason alone, we say that you delete the default VPC and you create your own VPC network and your own firewall rules as and when needed. By default, the port 22, the RDP port, they are all open to the entire world. And the outgoing is open for all the VMs in your default VPC. So to add the extra layer of security, to be mindful of who is coming in, what is going out, what we recommend is, again, you delete the default VPC and create your own VPCs, add the subnets that you really need, and then think about the firewall rules to protect your resources. With that, over to you, Lax, for the remaining 3 bullet items.
And
thank you so much. Yeah, Lauren, sorry,
Yeah.
I was on mute. Yeah.
No,
So
that's perfect. Just before you get started, we did get a question. So hopefully we can cover this before we move on
Sure.
to the next.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So this question is, when you were showcasing a user not part of IAM and Google Cloud able to SSH into a GCE VM, is OS login a better option, or are there any better alternatives?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. It makes absolute sense. And in fact, I wanted to cover the IAP and I completely forgot. So thank you for bringing this up, Dheeraj. So the short answer is yes. If you are not supposed to use SSH keys, then what is the recommended method, right? The recommended method that we would suggest is, like you rightly pointed out, is OS login, or in fact, even better would be the IAP, Identity Aware Proxy SSH forwarding tunnel. Super simple to set up. In fact, now that I'm on the firewall screen, I can show you the setup very, very quickly. Let me figure out the right here. So if you notice this firewall rule, and I hope that everybody can read this rule, this rule, as you can see, applies only to the default VPC. In this rule, we are opening the port 22 for TCP and UDP, but who are we permitting? We are only permitting these 2 IP ranges, and skip this for a moment. This is for a separate purpose. This is the only range that you are allowing to SSH or use the port 22 in your default VPC. And this range is nothing but a Google reserved range for IAP, which is Identity Aware Proxy. If you do this, and then if I go back to my VMs, if you are using the IAP based SSH method, then you don't need to have an external IP to your VMs, which is again goes in your favor or improving your security posture. Like, for example, these two machines do not have an external IP because I have set them in my custom VPC, and I have set them using IAP, which is Identity Aware Proxy. And why do we like it so much? Because IAP follows the IAM permissioning. So if I go back to IAM, and you will see this is the only role that the user needs to be able to SSH if you are coming through the IAP based tunneling. So I hope that answers that question. Are there any other follow-up questions on this?
That's great. Thank you, Manish. I think we'll give people a moment if they have any other follow-up questions, but appreciate the question. Keep them coming in the chat. And for now, I think we'll move on to the next part of the presentation with you, Lex.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much, Manish, for the wonderful demo on all the concepts around, securing the VM with the SSH key, which is publicly wide open, and all other concepts are so useful. And I know, yeah, I think Dheeraj also acknowledged that. Yeah, let's get started with the other three main topics of securing the Google Compute Engine. So before that, let me give a quick introduction. This is Lakshmanan Sethu. I'm a technical account manager for Google Cloud. And yeah, so today we're going to cover the three other topics: firewall rule, external IP, shielded VM, and one another topic which is closely with shielded VMs, confidential VM. So let's get started. So as everybody knows, right, firewall rule. The firewall rule is the basic network component, which is, it can be used to secure your VMs, virtual machines, right, based on the port, source IP, destination IP, and within the specific VPC. So it's a guardrail, one of the guardrail which we can use to secure your VM. So let's go deep into that firewall rule specific. So you can have let's say, before we get into the firewall, I want to give some basic introduction on how we are going to secure the VM, the Google Compute VMs with the help of IAM and API Scope. So those days, when we started the security around Compute Engine, API Scope was the main, was the only guardrail which used to secure your VM. What does it mean is, API Scope, when you create a VM, it gets it gets a special some permission, the default permissions. With Momentum, it's a centrally managed, security mechanism. Like I am nothing but identity access management, which can be, you can assign roles for all the GCP product at a central place, and it can be managed, deleted across. It's repeatable, so it's pretty centrally managed and organized, where your organization, Google administrator or infrastructure administrator, can manage the permissions alone, right, irrespective of the application. It's a complete abstract between the development team and the networking team. So that's how the IAM comes into picture. So the compute engine, in order to secure your compute engine, we need to do these two settings, right? So one is you give IAM role for that compute engine, right? So and you have to set the API scope for that specific VM. So we need to do these two settings to make sure your VMs are secure, right? So how do we provide IAM role, right? So IAM roles can be provided directly to your user account, which is not advisable, because, for example, you have an address like abc at some organization.com, we cannot give IAM role to the specific username, right? So everything is, we have the applications running, so you have to have a service account. Service account is nothing but your credentials, username, and password for the specific applications of your organization, right? So basically, so you have to choose a service account. So that's a basic difference between service account and user account. Service account is used by your application. User account is for something you use to log into the system and manage something, right? So it's always recommended to use service account to run your application, so that your permissions can be centrally managed. So how do we give IAM role for the specific service account, right? So this is the best practices. We always, as Munish mentioned, please don't ever try to use the default service account that comes with every VMs, because that's all for a playground purposes. It has all the permission inherited from your organization policy. So we would definitely recommend to create your least privileged service account in along with the API scope, right? So this is the matrix which I would love to talk about it, right? So for example, API scopes can be applied to a virtual machine, as I mentioned, right? So but IAM role, it's an identity which can be includes your service account or user accounts. So mutable, right? In terms of mutable, yes, APIs for enabling adding more permission to the API scope for that specific VM, the VM has to be shut down and you have to apply the permission. But as I mentioned, IAM is centrally managed. You don't need to do anything to your GCP resources. Your applications are serving your customers, but in the meantime, you can change your IAM roles at any time. So that's the beauty of IAM role. And granularity, we talked about the permission granularity. IAM is very specified. You can choose a specific IAM role for your VMs. For example, you're only looking for cloud storage, you can choose only the cloud storage viewer or editor objects. So it's very specific. Granularity is very broad for the API scope. So the best practice, yes, use the combination of both. Make sure you use the custom designed or specifically least privileged service account for your user case, and with a combination of API scope and IAM role. So I want to take a pause here and see if you have any questions around service accounts, IAM role, API scope, which is pretty basic for all compute engine security concepts. Yeah, I think there are no questions at the moment. Let me move forward. So in order to describe that firewall rule with the help of service accounts, I'm going to show you this simple two-tier architecture where you have a web application and your database applications, right? For example, the database applications is my SA has a service account, my service account database, and the web server has my service account web server. So those were the service accounts. So how we are going to allow this communication to happen between those two VMs, right, in your organization, for example. So this is how you should define your firewall rule, allow this traffic, TCP port 1443, with the service account, my SA web server, and the subnet with the VPC configurations. And this is the pretty fine grind permission that I'm talking about, right? So we are not opening to the whole world. So it's specific to your application, specific to the port, specific to your VPC, and specific to that database server where, specific to the database server and the web server, right, which can interact, right? So these are the firewall rule I would like to talk about and see, an example. And this is a clear example of a least privileged usage of service account on setting up your firewalls between the two VMs, in turn, which becomes a firewall rule for your whole application. Yeah. Okay, let's get into this VM instance connectivity. So some of the topics are briefly touched by Munish during the demo, but we would like to again go through those best practices. As already mentioned by Munish, yes, we should avoid external IPs mostly as possible. In some cases, if you need to allow that VMs to have an external IP, use the organization policies to enforce it. For example, you set the organization policy at the top level, make sure these are the exceptions of the machines where can have an external IP, so that another VMs cannot inherit or something. So in any, the next one is load balancer, right? So load balancer sits at top of your VMs, which distribute your requests, web requests to the VM, which is running your application. That's how a typical two-tier or three-tier applications in cloud is designed. So use Cloud Balancer as much as possible. Don't expose your VM directly to your application. So then another option is VPN or interconnect, in case if you want to connect from your on-premise locations to Google Cloud. There's multiple connect options available, VPN or interconnect. I don't want to go deep into why one is better or another or a specific use case, but yeah. So with VPN or interconnect, you can make this SSH access that Manisha demoed to private IPs from on-premises, right? So the purpose of interconnect is to connect your on-premise to your Google Cloud, right? So that's possible with Cloud VPN or interconnect. So yes, another topic, identity aware proxy. There was a question from Dheeraj, and we covered the help of demo. You can allow SSH or RDP in case of Windows machine, right? So through identity aware proxy TCP tunneling, which is pretty one click in Google Cloud Console, you can set it up, and it's pretty, you can SSH into your machine. Let's say you want to have your VMs are looking for updates from the outside world. For example, your VMs need to download some software updates, right? Any VMs has a SaaS application running in or any. So you can enable the NAT, network address translation, so that your compute can access the outside world through the NAT. You don't need to have external IP. So these are the best practices to securely connect to VM instance. Any questions so far?
Much on not having an external IP is, if you do have an external IP on your VMs, and if you go to Google Cloud logging and scan your VM, you will see that there are bots that are constantly trying to scan your project to get hold of the external IPs. You can actually see that in cloud logging in your own project. So that's why if you do not have the external IP assigned to your machines are not reachable over the internet. But with the cloud NAT that Lax just pointed out, the machines themselves can reach the outside world, but the outside world cannot reach your VMs.
Thank you, Manish. So I think we got a question from Tibor on, do we have a recommended point to site VPN? So what I need a clarification around this, Tibor. So what point to site VPN is? I don't know. I mean, there are different types of VPN. I know you're talking about that, right? Point to site or site to site VPN. I think Google Cloud. I think Munish, do you have any insight? I think
So basically, a question to Tibor would be: from where do you want to establish a connection to where? That's the question itself isn't very clear to me. So if you could elaborate,
yes,
from where to where are you talking about?
Yeah, yes, Tibor. Can you please briefly describe your use case? Let's say where you want to connect. For example, you want to connect from your personal machine to a site VPN or some other on-premise VPN. I don't know. I mean, we just need more information around that to give some clarity.
No, there is like we mentioned IAP. IAP is one of the methods for you to connect from any private machine to the machines in the Google Cloud Network using the G Cloud solution. Lauren, is there any way for me to write something here? Or actually, I am still sharing my screen, correct?
Yep.
All right. So I am pulling out the G Cloud Compute SSH. So this is using G Cloud. And with the help of IAP, if you have configured IAP, you can use G Cloud Compute SSH from any machine in the world to connect to any VM in your GCP project without the need of any VPNs. That's the whole beauty of it. Lauren, if you could share the link.
Yep, will do. Thanks for your questions. Feel free
Again,
to...
with the IAP configured, you do not need any VPNs. Any machine anywhere in the world can connect to a VM in GCP with the help of IAP without VPN.
Perfect. Thank you. And that link is now in the chat. So please feel free to check that out. And if you have any further questions or context, please continue to add that there. And I will go back to the slides now.
Yep. Thank you so much, Lauren. Let's move on to the next topic in securing the GCP VMs, right? So this is shielded VMs is one another important feature that we provide as a part of VM. It's pretty similar to your virtual machines, but in case if you want to have additional security around your VMs, so I would definitely recommend enabling this options, right? Shielded VMs. Shielded VMs are it's a part of when you create a VM, it's a part of your console. You see that as an option. So what it does, right? So it just validate, make sure to avoid any kernel level or guest OS level attacks, right? You want to make sure, because you're deploying your VMs on a guest OS, right? So you want to make sure you want to have additional layer of security for some business use cases. For example, I would like to quote like security companies or organizations which is providing SEM solutions or some healthcare. So there are certain specific use cases where the typical VM is needed. They want to have more additional guardrails. So we would recommend to go for a shielded VMs. So let's say you have these options, right? So you have the integrated monitoring, you have this virtual platform module, so turn on the secure boot as well. So what it does, right? What's the difference between so whenever there is your VM is booted, shielded VM is booted, your hash component of all the kernels and all the OS internal components, root level components will be calculated. They make sure they matches with every time. It's stored internally and it matches with every time there is a boot, right? So we want to make sure that there is no specific attacks, bot attacks, or any attacks in the VMs. So this is the best way to go at choosing the shielded VMs. So there is no additional cost on enabling this feature. So it's just provided as an option. So we can enable. I mean, it's not specific additional cost on enabling the shielded VM. It's not a separate So it's a part of your VM. You can enable it. So what it does is integrated monitoring. So you have the monitoring available with the VM. So it just, whenever there is a difference between the boot component, right? The hash component, different. If they see the difference, it will be logged, and the security team can take action about this. You can either shut down the VMs, or you can just send an event to your team to make sure that there is some kind of unknown event happening in your organization. So these are the additional protections that's been part of shielded VMs. Yeah, it's available as a part of VM selections when you do in a GCP console. So feel free to try those additional security feature of VMs. So as I mentioned about, this is what I talked about. So we want to, it ensures that the root trust is maintained for any boots, right? So ensure that the internal components like firmware is unmodified. So you have to have a certain VM. So you cannot enable this for all the images. So you need to have the certain OS images. So when you talk about images, it's the images can be in a copy of your VMs with, you can create your custom images also, but Google comes up with some default images. You can create multiple VMs using that images, right? So these are the container optimized images such as Windows Server, container optimized OS. So these are the major OS images supported, right? So because you cannot just create VMs, shielded VMs around all other options available in the market. So again, you can also create a custom image on top of shielded image, and then you can further use that custom image to build your own VM. So that's additional options provided as part of shielded VM. So any questions around shielded VMs? Yeah, another, I think I missed out before that. Yeah, this shielded VM is wholly built upon a chip, Titan chip. The chip name is Titan chip. So we use specific chip called Titan chip to ensure that we get all those secure boot functionality or features you get. It's all provided by this Titan chip. So any questions around shielded VMs before I dive into the next topic? Okay. Yeah, let's talk about confidential VM. So this is another features that we provide as a part of VM family to secure your VMs, right? So confidential VM, it's pretty much similar to same compute engine VM, but what it does, right? The only major difference is encryption, right? So encryption can happen in 3 ways. You can have encryption at transit, or while in usage, while you're using the data, or at rest, right? So rest, so transit is like you're communicating when you're communicating between multiple resources, yeah, during the transit, like during the network transit. Or at rest, it's something like, you store your data, for example, object storage or any storage you use, right? How the data is encrypted. So at rest, right? So that's the rest option. And the option that we are focusing here in confidential VM is usage, right? So whenever you're using your data, right, on the fly, so it's in memory encrypted data. So memory encrypted data, it's available on the specific chip. And yeah, so let's say you won't have the data encrypted even while using, right? So this is the option I would recommend. So the confidential VM is what it is provide additional level of encryption while you're using the data, which is not given by your compute engine, right? So this is what the confidential VM is all about. And we talked about, and we have some configurations, right? It scales up to 224 CPUs and 896 GB memories. So yeah, I think any questions around confidential VM? Right. So business use case around confidential VM is, again, let's say you have some medical or any healthcare organizations, they want to have their secure your PI data, right? The personal identity information, or most of the healthcare organization, because they want to secure their patients' data. So that's how you've seen people going for confidential VM. That specific case, in case if you have a organization-wide security, or your government or nationwide security, which requires you to encrypt the data even while usage, confidential VM is the another security and a feature that we provide along with virtual machines. So let me give a pause here. I want to ask anybody, if you have any questions around confidential VM or shielded VMs, firewalls, anything on the securing the VMs, feel free to shoot us.
Thank you so much for the presentation and the information. I think we'll give people a little bit of time to continue to ask their questions. Before moving on to some resources, are there any other information or demos that you'd like to cover? And then we can share some resources and then hop into some of the pre-submitted questions as well. All right.
I mean, yeah, we don't have demos for this, as we already mentioned right there. And so I think, yeah, we are good. Manish, if you have anything else to add, and yeah, feel free.
All right, we'll move on to some resources and then we'll hop into the Q&A. So please continue to ask your questions into the chat and we'll be sure to get to them. But before doing that, just sharing a few resources. So this first one at the top is the Google Cloud community. So this is where you can ask any further questions, find answers, engage with each other and Googlers. And you can also stay up to date on future events like this one there. So if you're not already a member, definitely encourage you to check that out. And the link is also in the YouTube description. And then, as I mentioned, we have a couple of upcoming events. So this week we have one on diving into your logs using SQL and learning Google Cloud for AWS and Azure professionals. And you can keep an eye on future events at that third link. And then lastly, we would love to hear your feedback. If you have any suggestions for future sessions, future topics that you want to hear about, or any thoughts that you want to share on today's session, we'd love to hear from you. And that feedback form, we'll drop it into the chat. Should take just 30 seconds to a minute, and we'd love to hear from you. Okay, now we'll move on to your questions, and we're actually see one that we got into the chat just now.
Yeah.
Can you change the encryption method in Confidential Compute Engine?
Tibor, that's a great question. Since this encryption method is done by Google Cloud, right? So it's not something customer can choose to change the encryption method. So it's all encryption in usage. It's provided as a part of product. So unfortunately, it's not possible with Confidential Compute Engine. In case if you want to have a different encryption method, there are other options with the help of customer managed encryption key, right? So CMEK. But yeah, those are the other options, for using your own encryption methods and keys. But unfortunately, in this confidential VM, yeah, we cannot. It's not possible to change the encryption method. What I'm trying to say is it's more of out-of-box feature. So yeah, it's not possible.
All right. Thank you. All right, we'll take one of our pre-submitted questions is, how do you recommend using a service account to access a Google Sheet, Drive, or chat API while limiting the service account's rights to use only these APIs and nothing else in Google Cloud?
I can take that. So this goes back to our point earlier that the principles of least privileges, and that's essentially what the question is asking. So if you remember from our discussion a little earlier today, Lax touched upon the API scopes. So this is where you will enable only the specific APIs and not the entire Google Cloud platform. So if I go back to my screen share,
Yep.
going back to the VMs, go back to the same VM. So right here, if you see, this is something you should not do. This is just for the demo. Here you can restrict what are the API scopes that you want to allow or permit. And for making any changes to these API scopes, you do need to restart the VM. But essentially, this is where you will allow the specific APIs that can be that are accessible to this VM. I hope this answers your question. And like I said, you do need a VM restart. And this is, of course, configurable through automation like Terraform or any other automation that you might be using.
Awesome. Thank you for showing that.
Yep. Thank you, Manish, for showing that.
Great. Okay. Sure. Our next question is, what are examples of when you'd want to use Workforce Identity Federation and how to get started?
I can take that. So let's say this way, that without the use of, and it's not workforce, it's workload, without the use of workload identity federation, you would end up relying on service accounts. You will generate a key to the service account and you will use that key in order to connect from outside Google or outside GCP into GCP. What is the problem there? The problem is that the key that we just mentioned is a long-lived key. And there are a number of instances where the key gets leaked due to a mistake somebody made, or the key got uploaded somehow to public sites. The key somehow got leaked. And once the key is leaked, whatever roles you had assigned to these service accounts, the hacker or the bad actor can use that key in order to impersonate and use the roles that the service account had. And hence we introduce the workload identity federation, or WIF. So what are the examples? Let's say all your code base sits in GitHub or any other cloud repository, and you want to use the automated CI/CD from, let's say, GitHub again, or any other code repository, to be able to automate the deployment of the code, building the artifacts and pushing the code to Google Cloud Platform. So in this case, the GitHub or the code repositories needs to be able to connect to GCP. And as we just mentioned, you don't want to use service account key. The workload identity federation is the perfect way to set up and connect the GitHub with GCP without the use of keys. How do you get started? So if you simply say workload identity federation GCP, we can share that link with you. It has excellent documentation, including the full-fledged end-to-end examples. So Lauren, if you could share this, please.
Will do.
Yeah, I got the documentation. Manish, can I share it?
And in addition to this documentation, there is a GitHub repo for Google Cloud Platform that also has working examples. Yeah, this is the one. So if you browse through this repo, you will find a working example right out of the box for workload identity federation.
Yeah. Thank you, Manish. I would like to add a couple of more points to this questions. We support AWS identity as well as Azure Active Directory identity as a part of workload, federation, workload identity federation. So you can import. What I'm trying to say is you can import your identity from there to access the Google Cloud resources by configuring this workload identity, federation. It's not only supporting GitHub, it supports AWS, it supports Azure components as well. And I know that is the whole list, sorry, yeah, it's in front of you. So it supports Active Directory, on-premise Active Directory, Okta, Kubernetes clusters.
Perfect. And those links are in the chat now for you to access. Awesome. Thank you both. I think we'll just take one more question here, but if you do have any others, please use that chat. So the last question we'll take for today is, what are the security implications using a Google Cloud Storage public bucket for a static www or website, and how to mitigate them?
I can take that. So security implications using GCS public bucket for a static www and how to mitigate them. So I think I'm not sure if the person who asked this question is still around for a clarification question. Otherwise, I'll make my assumptions. If the intent is to host static content in a GCS for the entire world, then I don't foresee any security implications. You have to make it a public bucket. If that is the intent, that I'm going to host my static assets like BIFs or GIFs or anything static in my GCS bucket, and I'll front that. In fact, if it's a static content, I'll front it with I'm skipping the name. Basically the equivalent to Akamai.
CDN.
Thank you. I'll front the GCS bucket with our cloud CDN if the content is indeed static. And but like I said earlier, that if the intent is you want to open that content to the entire world, then it has to be a public bucket. So that's where I'm a little lost. But if the intent is not, if the intent is that you are hosting the static content and it is only for your internal consumption, then you should not have a public bucket. The security implication is, as the name suggests, it's public. So the entire world can access the bucket, and so the content can be served. Now, what are the security implications? One, it can bump up your cost by many folds. How? Because GCS, one component is egress from GCS to wherever the content is getting served. And if your intent wasn't for the outside world, but by mistake you misconfigure it to be a public bucket, there are bots that are looking every single time in order to manipulate or exploit those vulnerabilities. So if you have a public bucket, expect your bill to be pretty high, the egress bill to be pretty high. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, Lauren and Manish, I have to add my 2 cents here. Yes. So we need to more specific on the use case, what you're trying to see. Yeah, it's always possible to serve your content through GCS, right? It's a cost-effective way. Let's say you don't want to set up a dynamic site using, you develop a site using GKE or VMs. Let's say static is pretty useful. I've seen a lot of use cases, customers are using it. Again, yeah. As Manish mentioned, yeah, you need to make sure it's you are serving it internally or serving it to externally. Again, you can use the GCS security guardrails, like allowing the list of IPs, right? So let's say you are using it for internal, your internal IPs, right? Where your organization's IP, so you can make sure you allow or whitelist those IPs, right? Instead of allowing it to the whole public. Yeah, you know where the users are coming from. Yes, those are the security guardrails that applicable to the bucket, GCS bucket. You can use this also. Yeah.
And yeah, just to add more to that, the security command center catches these sort of misconfigurations and it reports it. And the other point that I wanted to make is, well, I just forgot. I just forgot. Yeah, the security command center can definitely catch these sort of misconfigurations. Yeah, now I remember. So what I wanted to say is you can have the organization policy constraints to enable those guardrails that Lex was pointing to. You can have the organization policy constraint to disallow, for example, the creation of a service account key, or to disallow having the public buckets in the first place.
Great. Awesome. Well, that does look like all of the questions that we've gotten through the chat. If you do have any others, please feel free to utilize the Google Cloud community. And that link is here as well as in the YouTube description. And finally, we'd love to hear from you again in that feedback form, which is now in the chat box. Thank you so much, Lax and Manish, for this presentation, the demos, and information that you shared. I know this will certainly be valuable. Thank you all for the folks who joined us. We hope you learned something new today about how to secure your compute engine VMs. Any final thoughts? Any final recommendations before we close out today?
I don't.
So, yeah. Manish, yeah. So it's always important to secure your infrastructure, GCP infrastructure. So make sure, again, any security is all we are stressing here mostly on the least privilege, right? Or least privileged access. So you start with least privileged access, give the right minimum permissions to your VMs. That's how you start building your application. As and when you explore, you go beyond the territory. Yeah, you change the permission level, but it's always good to start with the least privileged access to your VMs, to your service account, and build the add the more and more IAM roles as we interact with more application, or as your business cases are evolving. Yeah, that's one tip I would love to share. Yeah,
Maybe I'll add one too, and
yeah.
that is that we picked up compute engine. Doesn't mean that compute engine is the only one that you need to protect. You do need to protect your entire infrastructure. You may be running compute engine, you may be running cloud SQLs, you may be running the storage in GCS. Everything needs to be protected. We just picked one topic, compute engine. Doesn't necessarily mean that this is the most important from a security standpoint. Everything that you're deploying, every infrastructure that you're setting up on GCP needs to be protected with the right set of controls and guardrails.
Great point. And just showing again what we covered. If you wanted to revisit this, you can always check out the recording as soon as we close out today. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for that information, and we hope to see you next time.